and Rod Snider.
Hey, everybody. All right, well, today we're going to talk about a project that's been long in the making. It started back in 2009, Games for a New Climate. It's a collaboration between my organization, Pet Lab, the Red Cross, American Red Cross, as well as the International Red Cross, Red Crescent. We also have Ben Norskov here, who's a former student of mine, but also runs Antidote games. So we're going to talk about our work with the Red Cross from both an academic research perspective, as well as a more, what would you guys call yourselves? Like a
games consultancy.
Games consultancy, yeah, that makes sense. And we have Rod here from the Red Cross. We're going to introduce ourselves more officially here in a second. But this is going to be a story in 3 parts. It's going to start where I hope we all try to start and not end, with failure. We're going to, hopefully, we find some redemption midway through this story, a couple of years into the project. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the future of the work that we've done. But first, I'd like to introduce, or at least have the folks up here introduce themselves. So Rod, take it away.
Thanks, Colleen.
Who are you?
Hi, I'm Rod Snider. I work for the American Red Cross based in Washington, D.C. I'm the director of our Quality and Learning Unit, which is largely our technical unit, which is tasked with developing global tools and global methodologies and then supporting our teams in the field to be able to implement and take those projects forward. My career has mostly been in the field. I spent 15 years in developing countries, post-conflict, and I'm a graduate of NYU, so it's good to be kind of back home.
In the house.
Yeah.
Rad. Yeah, Rod like actually saves the world, in short. We also have Ben Norskov here.
I run a small games consultancy called Antidote Games. We think of ourselves as a not just for profit. And then I also teach part-time at Parsons with Colleen. So we try to make more new burgeoning game designers.
Cool. And I'm Colleen Macklin. Here I am looking really confused, along with my partner John Sharp, who together we run Pet Lab, the prototyping education and technology lab at Parsons. And we've been working with the Red Cross now, as I said, for about 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, wow.
We also make a game called the Metagame, which if you don't have one now, you can get it on Amazon. Sorry, folks.
It's a great game. We've actually used parts of it in the field, and it's a lot of fun. So.
Yeah, we have actually used it in some of this work. So to start, failure. I'm going to tell a story of failure, and the rest of us are going to talk a little bit about some of our failures early on. One thing I can say is that when you go to another country, you have to remember it's not just like your own. Let me explain. This is a set of dice. They were found in Mesopotamia. They've been dated to probably about 5,000 years old. I love this image because it's amazing how similar the dice we use in a Monopoly game are to these dice, right? They're 6-sided. They have 1 through 6 on them. It's kind of like game technologies are among the oldest in the world. Maybe they definitely predate language. Maybe they're around the time when we invented the wheel. I'm not quite sure, but I'm not a historian. Just game designer, folks. But you know, we kind of take them for granted today. We use them all the time. This is an image of the aftermath of a game that we designed called Ready, which some of my students in the design and technology program at Parsons worked with John and I on. And it uses lots of dice. In fact, when we brought these to Namibia, the participants in the project saw all these dice, and their eyes like just became larger than their heads. It was really kind of incredible. They'd never seen so many in one place. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then as we kind of went along and worked with people to learn how to play the game, and the gameplay is really pretty simple. Everybody's brainstorming and writing up things that they would do in the case of a flood. Most of these games are about being prepared for a disaster. So in this case, we were in a community that floods a lot. And they would assign the dice to different tasks that you could perform in order to be prepared. And then there would be this thing where you run around and roll the dice and try to complete these tasks. And we quickly realized that a lot of people had never thrown a set of dice before. So we had to include, of course, in the explanation of our rules for the game, an explanation of how to roll dice and a demonstration of how it actually works. Now, later on, I was talking to one of the Red Cross volunteers in Namibia where we were, and I said, wow, it's pretty interesting. So you guys don't, play games with dice that much, where like there's kids in the background like kicking soccer balls around and playing all kinds of games. This is the context of the games, usually under a tree somewhere outside. So we're not making video games because it's hard to string power from a tree somewhere when you're in rural Namibia. So I asked one of the volunteers, I was like, how, people aren't familiar with these things. And they said, well, it's not just that. They're associated with a really bad thing, and that's gambling and vice. And I thought, thinking back to actually a small child who walked up to me looking at the dice, being so fascinated, and of course I gave him some. And I'm like, oh my God, what have I done here? I've completely brought the wrong technology, the most inappropriate technology into this setting. So that's fail number one.
When we went to Vietnam, we had a game called Officers of Otago that we had actually developed more recently in this process that we worked with the Red Cross. And it was pretty successful. We originally did it for Ugandan government ministers, and it was about sort of planning for the future and planning resilient networks. But when we had to go to Vietnam, we had to translate everything into Vietnamese, of course. And what we didn't realize that certain words, specifically resiliency in Vietnamese, is 5 words long. And so if you see the cards there, it doesn't fit on the card. So even after we knew that like this game could work in various contexts, that we just had to translate it, even just the translation worked. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the game being played in context. Because it was played outside of the context that we knew, this is just one small thing that can go wrong when you fail to realize the context in which the game is going into.
So you guys designed cards that were too small?
Well, too small for Vietnamese.
Okay. And I've corrupted the youth of Namibia. What do you think, Rod?
Well, it's funny. Well, we do a lot to try to build resilience of a community. And this word resilience is a new emerging term within the international humanitarian community. Resilience doesn't translate in the top 20 languages, right? And so it's this idea of taking kind of Western concepts and then try to apply them in the field is very challenging. And this is where we got excited about games, because the majority of things that we do working with communities such as Namibia is try to build their capacity through training. But we have this saying about training, overused, ineffective, best we have, right? So this is what the bulk of what we do, but it doesn't really work. And so we started experimenting with games, and we found that it was really successful. And I want to give an anecdote example of what we mean by games. So in Ethiopia, we were working with farmers that were often in a flood drought cycle, and they couldn't predict, particularly with climate change, they just weren't predictable anymore. So we set up a scheme on microinsurance, trying to spread the wealth. Now, insurance is something that most of us in the United States has grown up with, so it's a concept that we understand. However, I don't know how many of you have read your insurance policy lately, but if you read through it, you get confused pretty quick. So how do you explain insurance to Ethiopian farmer? And so we did a dual test where we went in and just did two-way learning, two-way capacity building, telling the farmers about what insurance is. You pay a bit of money, and if you get affected, you'll get money back in small amounts. But we also created a game where they actually got to experience a drought cycle through a 10-year period and got to feel it. And what we found out is that two-way communication in the games, the information was basically understandable, but what was really amazing about the game is that the trust level was really increased because they got to experience it, and therefore the microinsurance scheme was much more successful. So it's this idea of using, particularly in adult education in these settings where, people are very smart, they're just not used to climate change and some of these concepts. So if they can experience it, they're more apt to self-organize and take action on their own, and that's our ultimate goal.
Play over PowerPoint. So,
Yeah,
maybe
PowerPoints, yeah.
fails to generate trust, although the knowledge kind of gets communicated, right?
Hence, here we are with the PowerPoint. We should be playing a game with you guys.
I know, what? Whoops, failure, number 3. So this brings us to redemption, and the idea that I like to think about is that failure in the process and any process is like a flashlight, right? Kind of reveals the spooky stuff that's out there that we know is going to happen, and actually maybe those glowing eyes aren't actually monsters. Maybe they're cute bunny rabbits, in the night, and we can kind of see things for as they are, right? And we shine that kind of failure flashlight on things. We can actually try to figure out how the failure illuminates a path forward, a way to actually do something. Now, this doesn't just mean, okay, let's not bring dice with us for the next game. Let's revise the game and not use dice, because I don't think that actually fixes the problem. The problem is a bigger one. You kind of have to zoom out and realize, well, gosh, why are we designing these games and then bringing them and playing them for the first time in another place? So we hit the reset button, and we went, in this case, these are some photographs from our time in Uganda. John Sharp and I and a student went to Uganda to work with Red Cross staff there. And the first thing that we did was figure out the games that are actually played in Uganda, right? That kind of makes sense, and I don't know why we didn't understand that before, but this is a confessional here in front of all of you. So we quickly learned, actually, you do see a die there, so there were some dice-based games. There were also some really games that I had a hard time learning, like Mancala, super strategic and very mathematical, and a bunch of other games that we learned. And we quickly realized this opportunity to go into a community, and instead of saying, hey, play this game, it's about being prepared for floods, saying, show us the games you play, right? And starting in that way, and having us fail, and having us kind of fail together in the game, created a new dynamic as well. The participants were much more open. Now, this also led to an interesting thing. When we get back to New York, we start to create games, and we created a game that was based on a game that we were told was very popular in Uganda. We had some imagery to help us out, but it's sort of a call and response singing game. This is a photograph of my students, incredibly embarrassed, trying to design this call and response singing game. Because here, I could have shown you the video, but I was too embarrassed, actually. In the West, we don't oftentimes just get together and start singing with each other, and singing back and forth and improvising, although we should. So we quickly learned that makes it even harder to refine and test here the games that we might learn about there. Ultimately, we went back to Uganda with this game, and it was like a wild success. We were really excited that here you see a woman actually improvising and dancing and creating new kind of improvisational, interpretational dance moves to the game that we designed called Future Song, which involves calling and responding problems and responding with solutions. So step in the right direction, although really makes it hard to then take that game and refine it and play test it back home sometimes.
And as part of trying to learn other cultures' play culture, we took a game called Humans versus Mosquitoes, which was originally designed for the United Nations Climate Conference in South Africa. And as part of this Red Cross initiative, my partner Mohini took it to Kenya. You can see a picture of her in this next slide. And we played, she played this game all over Kenya, and in different parts of Kenya, she realized that the context that the game had to be adaptable to what people were dealing with in that area. On the coast in Kenya, then they had a big drought, so malnutrition had to be adapted into this game. And then in the Rift Valley, AIDS was a bigger problem than malnutrition, so they had to put AIDS into the game somehow. And then when they took the game into an urban context, the position of breeding grounds in trash had to be adapted into the game. And so and this was just one country, and we needed 3 different contexts for a game to be working in one country. And so we used this, I think the next slide has her in a school in Kenya there. When we used this, when we did this research, we did some research on it and used this knowledge to help create better games. It's like, how can we better integrate context of the local participants into a game and also build adaptable game systems? Now when we build a game system, we include facilitator guidelines, where the facilitator can insert their own creativity and their own local knowledge into the game. And that makes it a lot more accessible and a lot more relevant to the people playing.
It's important to recognize that these are all non-digital games, so somebody needs to explain the rules, right? So the facilitation piece is really key, is really important. Here we are in Uganda again, and learning local games, playing them, and understanding that that's the platform we should be using, right? There's already kind of knowledge embedded in the community around games that they've been playing since they were young people. Here I am playing a local game that involves rhythmically passing rocks, and I completely messed up, and it was super funny for everyone else but me. But you know, learning that the community has these sort of, you know, cultural practices. Obviously, that's something that we should have realized and kind of did, but you know. It makes so much more sense when you actually go and sit down and play a game with someone, you know, where they live. And then we finally came up with, instead of bringing games, instead of making games, instead of being game designers, really we had to kind of return to what, you know, John Sharp and I are in the first place, and that's people who teach game design. So we started to take the local games and design, instead of for the communities, so instead of designing games for the communities to be prepared in the case of a flood or a drought or whatever it might be, designing with the community. So we started to design games with the community, and we took that concept. We spent a lot of time actually refining a co-design workshop that would help people who had never made a game before. Although I have to say, most people have modified games in the playground, so we usually learn game design in recess at school, but had never really done that before. And to take local games, to take games that people have been playing their whole lives, and then fit the concepts into them, right? And you can usually see mechanics that start to relate to what you're trying to say in the game. I know that we like to think of these sort of handcrafted, artisanal games that are designed with mechanics that express the elements, you know, or challenges or issues. But ultimately, it kind of makes more sense just to go, learn, and make something that's based on a local knowledge that you can actually make really work and you can make fit. So Rod was there during this event.
Well, I mean, there was a step in there, a learning step too, where we actually ended up developing, we felt, good games with cultural context, but we couldn't get people to use it. We couldn't get regular project managers to integrate that into their projects. So we would go out, we would facilitate games, we would train them on how to do it. They said, this is great, we're gonna do it. Then we would leave, and they just didn't have the ownership in it, even though it was a good game and it was applicable to them. So this idea of co-designing is really important, and we deal with this just with even our own global tools and approaches, is how do you take best practices that's all over that you learn, how do you pull that into a useful tool and approach that then is applicable at the ground level? And a lot of times what happens is you pull those best practices in, but because you're trying to make it global, it becomes a watered down version and it's not very effective to that project manager itself. But yet you can't have every single country learning on its own, right, and making things up, because then that's too costs too much and it's not very effective. So there had to be something in between. So we piloted this co-design process where we started with the Vietnamese playing their own games, right? Because every culture has their own games, and it's often a big part of their culture. But we gave them a platform to help them contextualize their games to the projects that we were doing. And it was amazing. Over 3 days, given with John and Colleen, giving them structure, helping to facilitate what game design is, helped to keep them focused so you didn't get too far out. They ended up coming up with three good games, one game that can be adapted to certain contexts. And if you go to this one, that's John. They came up with a game. They have a project in Vietnam where they actually invented, through a different competition, they have a backpack that floats. It acts as a life jacket because kids often walk to school along canal roads where there's a lot of water and there's been a lot of drowning. So they actually have backpacks that the kids have from school that they float. And they created a game to show the importance of learning how, water safety, and they taught the game and then handed out the backpack, and the use of the backpack increased quite a bit. So it's a really good process. The games they ended up still being a little not very complex, and so that was the challenge of the co-design, is that you wouldn't be able to come out with a microinsurance game, for example, in that, but they were good games to communicate some really good ideas, and again, through that experiential learning.
Yeah, definitely. I think, the key to just about anything is the iterative process. It's starting with an idea, prototyping it, play testing it, and seeing where it completely fails, which is kind of the process over 7 years that we had with each other. And then evaluating the results and going back to the beginning again, right, with that new knowledge and actually refining over and over again. That's something that I think we also really emphasized in the workshop, and ultimately can be used for a lot of different design tasks, not just game design. But when you're a Red Cross staff member and you've got a program that you want to get off the ground, you can really start to think about it through this iterative cycle. And we actually talked to some of the participants, and this for them, just alone, was one of the bigger takeaways from the whole session. So.
No, we've used it with other things now.
Yeah.
Taking off that. Yeah.
And just like we're iterating on games, we're iterated on our process to make co-design workshops. So Mohini again went to Indonesia and the Philippines. This is a game that was designed in the Philippines to try to integrate co-design and game design into local communities. And we really like this process because we feel that it's really empowering to the people on the ground. It really gives them ownership. And especially if you have, if you bring in game design methodologies that we have developed as teachers and as game designers, and give those to someone else, then that creates a play culture. And some of the games that were made were amazing. Our favorite one was the stick and bottle game, where you had to tie a string to your waist to a stick, and then without speaking together, maneuver that stick into the bottle. And this was a game that talked about community communication in the face of difficult problems that the community would have to face. And it's just fantastic. And I would have never thought of this game. This is like local design coming out.
Nice. I want to play that. So that's kind of, I mean, it was sort of a long and winding path, to kind of get from designing for to designing with, and finally just providing the tools, right, like the fishing pole instead of the fish, for the use of games in community outreach and programmatic stuff that the Red Cross is doing. So let's talk a little bit about the future. Rod, what's going on right now?
We're not at an impasse, but it's this. We got to find that tipping point, because people that we play games with get it, but it's hard to really take it to scale. It's really hard to sustain it. It's really hard to mainstream it. Again, that project manager's already, got their sense of things. How do they incorporate games? It's anything with innovation. So we're trying to seed it from the bottom, look at leverage points, look at champions, trying to get some successes so other people see it, to then build it up. So we're kind of letting it mature and grow organically before we then go back and really put an emphasis on it.
And I've been really impressed. I know that games that have been designed by Red Cross staff with communities, some of the games that we've been using, even Ready has been used in different communities, urban and rural, and in more than 30 countries. So we're talking about work that's really like caught on in a widespread way, but is also really hard to sustain, right, and keep going. And I think that's kind of our next step, is how to kind of design a solution for
How to
that.
mainstream it, exactly.
Yeah. And Ben, you kind of have something you're working on.
A lot of what Antidote is doing right now is trying to find new methodologies for building games when you have to build an insurance game, and you can't always rely on local knowledge, which often people have far more than you ever expect. So we have this methodology we call mindful play, and we're working on this as well in the iterative process. But the first one is to sort of forget your play culture when you have to design for someone else's, and try to immerse yourself in their play culture. And we've all learned these steps from doing it what we feel is incorrect. The next one's similar, is like use unique or locally sourced assets. This allows you to skip the dice problem if you happen to do that. And also, and people on the ground as well have a lot of assets, and it'll also create ownership over the game.
One of my favorite examples of this is when we were in Uganda, and we had Future Song uses a ball. You toss the ball, you sing out your problem. The person that catches it sings out their solution. And we were told, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You don't have to bring any balls from the U.S. We're fine. And we were like, okay, we need a ball. And someone run off and then come back with some palm fronds and just go and make this perfect, like, beautiful woven soccer ball that we could play during the games. It was incredible.
Design for the conversation after the game. I think this is really important. The froth is what it's called in LARPing. Is like, if I'm not talking about the game I just played after the game, I think the game is actually sort of not a success. This is actually the measurement. And the last one is avoid on-the-nose design. Make a game not about the thing it's about, because your players will see that. If you get points in a recycling game for recycling, they're going to be like, why are you talking down to me? Of course I should recycle. This isn't modeling the real world.
I think that design for the conversation is also really key. When you, at the end, talk about, well, what in the game made sense and what totally doesn't make sense in your daily life, right? Like, how do you kind of bridge what I know Ian Bogost has called the simulation gap, the place where the game doesn't actually reflect real life. And that becomes the most constructive part, because then you're really thinking critically about what you do and what you did last time it flooded and what you might do in the future.
The debrief is absolutely the most important part of the games.
Yeah.
And it's facilitating that. And that's something that you have to train people to do, and that's where it's hard to get them to stick, because it's the game facilitator can run through the game, but it's that debriefing that's really important, and you have to sometimes pull that out and then turn it into action.
Pet Lab's going to be releasing the co-design workshop steps and some of the other games that have been made on a website, hopefully this summer. And John Sharp and I are also writing a game design book that will cover a lot of the techniques that we used in the co-design workshop and go further into non-digital and digital game design too. So conclusion, play is more powerful than PowerPoint. That's one of the first things we learned working together. Then we realized we need to design for the context, use failure as a learning opportunity. So not only in terms of failure in a game as a learning opportunity, but like looking at our process and figuring out what we're doing wrong. Learn local culture by playing local games. That's a great way in, rather than just asking questions. It's like, let's just get together and play. Designing with, not for. The iterative process takes failure into account, so that's one of the big takeaways from learning that as a co-design workshop. And then finally, practice these tenets of mindful play. Are you guys posting that somewhere?
Yeah, we gave a talk at Different Games a couple weeks ago, where we
Cool.
outlined it more in depth and the reason we made it, but we'll put it up.
Dynamite. It looks like we have 20 seconds left. I don't know if there's a quick question we might be able to answer, but otherwise, you can definitely find us on Twitter and in other places.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
I want to thank these guys for coming on stage with me. I'm really glad they were
Thank you.
here on both sides to help talk through failure and kind of show you all inside our process. But happy to answer questions after as well. Thanks so much.